A father is shot to death walking down a street in Chicago. Less than 24 hours later, 4 people are gunned down a mile away, 2 of them inside a restaurant, 2 of them chased down and killed in nearby parking lots. None of the 4 victims had anything to do with the father's murder. Police would eventually charge the dead man's 19-year-old son with all 4 killings. 3 years later, every single charge was dropped, not because anyone proved his innocence, but because every witness who saw it happen either disappeared or refused to testify. This is the story of Morris Harris, known on the streets and eventually in music as Lil Wet, later Drench, the son of a respected Chicago gang figure whose murder allegedly triggered one of the most brazen daylight retaliation killings the city has seen in years. It is a story about inherited violence, about what happens when witnesses are too afraid to speak, and about how a young man accused of taking 4 lives in a single afternoon went on to build a music career out of the same reputation that put him in a jail cell facing life without parole. Morris Harris was born in 1997 in the area of 78th and Kingston on Chicago's South Side, a stretch of the city that residents and rival factions alike refer to as Terror Town, long-standing territory associated with the No Limit Mob Boys, more commonly known by the abbreviation NLMB. In neighborhoods like this one, gang affiliation is rarely something a person actively chooses in the way an outsider might imagine. It is closer to an inheritance, determined almost entirely by which block you happen to be born on and which adults raise you. For Morris, that inheritance had a specific and deeply personal source. His father, Jerry Jacobs, known on the street as Big Wet, was a long-time, well-known figure within NLMB, described by people in the neighborhood as one of the set's senior, more established members. According to court and law enforcement records, Jacobs had been arrested dozens of times over the course of his life and had previously faced murder charges himself. Alongside other senior figures in the organization, he was understood within the neighborhood to be one of the people effectively running the day-to-day operations and reputation of Terror Town for years. The bond between father and son was, by all accounts, genuinely close. Big Wet did not simply provide for his son financially or occasionally. He actively brought him into the world he knew, teaching him, according to people who knew them both, exactly how to navigate the specific dangers and codes of conduct that govern life in that part of the city. Morris eventually took his father's nickname for his own, becoming known on the street first as Lil Wet, a tribute that doubled as a kind of inherited identity. It's worth pausing on the broader context here, because the violence that would eventually define the next several years of Morris's life did not emerge from nothing. By 2017, parts of Chicago's south and east sides were experiencing some of the highest concentrations of gun violence anywhere in the country, driven substantially by long-running, multi-generational conflicts between specific blocks and factions, conflicts that, much like inherited gang affiliation itself, tend to pass down from one generation to the next, largely unresolved. These conflicts rarely originate from any single, identifiable incident that an outside observer could point to as the root cause. Instead, they tend to accumulate over years and even decades, layering one act of retaliation on top of another until the original grievance becomes almost impossible to trace, while the underlying hostility between specific blocks and sets remains as active and lethal as ever. Children born into this environment do not experience it as a series of discrete, comprehensible events. They experience it as the simple, unquestioned texture of daily life, the same way a child raised near a coastline simply understands tides as a basic fact of their environment rather than something requiring explanation. For Maurice, that texture happened to include the very real possibility of sudden public violence breaking out at any moment, even during the most mundane parts of an ordinary day, like standing outside a corner store with friends after school. Morris's exposure to gun violence began remarkably early, well before he was anywhere close to adulthood. According to his own later account in interviews, he was struck by gunfire for the first time before he turned 14 during an incident in which a vehicle pulled up on a group of NLMB-affiliated teenagers standing outside a liquor store and opened fire, striking several people at once. He has described the injury from that incident as relatively minor in physical terms, but the psychological impact of the broader event was considerably heavier. Two of the people present that night, including a close friend he has only ever referred to by a street name, did not survive. He later got that friend's name tattooed on his arm, and according to people connected to the set, the entire group began informally dedicating their activity to that friend's memory from that point forward. When asked years later in a recorded interview whether the pain of losing that friend had faded over time, Morris's answer was notably unguarded. He said it had never really washed off, that it was simply something that would always be there, regardless of how much time passed. That kind of statement, offered without much performance or bravado, stands in sharp contrast to the more aggressive, defiant public persona he otherwise cultivated, and it offers a rare glimpse into how genuinely formative that specific early loss appears to have been for him, well before any of the events that would eventually make him a household name in certain corners of the internet. By his own count, and according to juvenile court records cited in subsequent news coverage, Morris had accumulated 29 separate arrests by the time he turned 18 on charges ranging from armed robbery to illegal firearm possession. His very first arrest occurred when he was just 12 years old. This is an extraordinary record for someone who had not yet reached legal adulthood, and it reflects more than anything else just how thoroughly and how early he had been absorbed into the same world his father had spent his own adult life navigating. By 2016, according to Street Reputation and various unverified accounts that circulated in the years that followed, Morris had reportedly built a name for himself within NLMB as someone willing to act decisively on the set's behalf, though it bears emphasizing that specific claims about his involvement in earlier, unrelated shootings during this period remain largely unconfirmed allegations rather than matters of legal record. What is clear is that by the time he turned 19, he occupied a position of real standing within Terrortown's social and criminal hierarchy, a position built in that world almost exclusively through demonstrated willingness to engage in violence rather than through age or formal leadership structure. It is worth noting here too that Morris's specific approach to building that reputation differed somewhat from the pattern that has since become common among many of his peers in Chicago's drill scene, where numerous artists in this same world built their public profiles in part by publicly claiming credit for specific acts of violence on social media or in lyrics. Morris was, by multiple accounts, notably more reserved about discussing his own alleged activities, preferring to let his reputation circulate through word of mouth rather than direct public claims. Whether that relative restraint was a deliberate legal strategy, a personal preference, or simply a reflection of his already extensive history with law enforcement and an accompanying wariness about generating more documented evidence against himself, It set him apart from several of the more self-promotional figures who would later populate the same scene. On March 29, 2017, Jerry Jacobs was walking down 79th Street in the South Shore neighborhood when a vehicle pulled up and multiple gunmen opened fire. He was struck several times in the torso and was rushed to a nearby hospital where he died in the early morning hours of March 30th. According to law enforcement accounts and street reporting that circulated afterward, the shooting was attributed to members of a rival faction known as Black Mob, with one individual in particular, a young man who had built a fearsome reputation for violence within that set, frequently named in connection to the killing in the months that followed, including in his own music, where he appeared to reference the shooting and openly antagonize Morris afterwards. It should be noted that, as with much of the retaliatory violence described in this story, formal criminal charges and convictions specifically tied to Jacobs' murder have not been part of the public record in the way the subsequent quadruple homicide case was. For Morris, the loss of his father was not simply the loss of a parent. It was the loss of the person who had shaped his entire understanding of the world he lived in, the person whose name he had already taken as his own street identity. By every account that followed, the news sent him into a state that those close to him described as something close to blind rage, a response driven by raw grief rather than any kind of calculated thinking about who specifically had been responsible. What happened next unfolded with a speed and a level of brazenness that shocked even a city with significant ongoing experience with gang-related violence. According to Chicago police and prosecutors, on March 30th, 2017, hours after his father was pronounced dead, Maurice, allegedly accompanied by another NLMB-affiliated associate serving as a getaway driver, traveled roughly a mile from where his father had been shot to a restaurant called Nadia's Fish and Chicken near 75th Street and Calhoun. According to the charges later filed against him, the specific individuals inside and around that restaurant that afternoon, Emmanuel Stokes, Edwin Davis, and brothers Dylan and Raheem Jackson, had no documented connection to his father's murder whatsoever. They were associated with a separate set entirely in a different part of the broader gang landscape. Prosecutors and police would later describe them as essentially being in the wrong place at the wrong time, present in a location that happened to fall within rival territory at the exact moment Maurice, by their account, was looking for any available target connected to the broader network of rivals he considered responsible, even loosely, for his father's death. Police allege that in broad daylight at around 3:30 in the afternoon, Morris exited a vehicle and opened fire at the restaurant, striking two of the men inside before they could escape further into the building. The other two men, the Jackson brothers, ran from the scene, and according to the charges, the gunman and his alleged getaway driver pursued them, ultimately catching and shooting both men in separate nearby parking lots. All four men died from their injuries. The entire sequence, according to the case prosecutors built, took place without the shooter wearing any kind of mask or face covering, an unusual and significant detail that would become central to the case built against him, since it meant several witnesses inside the restaurant reported getting a clear, unobstructed look at the gunman's face. Within days, Chicago police arrested Morris Harris, then 19 years old, at an address in the south suburb of Blue Island. He was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and held without bond. Police publicly stated that they believed the killings were retaliation connected to his father's murder less than 24 hours earlier, a connection investigators described as, in their words, a reasonable conclusion given the extraordinarily tight timeline between the two events. From the outset, the prosecution's case against Maurice rested almost entirely on eyewitness testimony rather than physical or forensic evidence. 3 separate witnesses to the shooting at Nadia's reportedly identified him as the shooter in the days immediately following the killings, a significant number of independent identifications for a single incident. Combined with his extensive juvenile arrest history and his documented gang affiliation, prosecutors appeared, at least initially, to have assembled a case substantial enough to pursue the maximum possible charges, with Harris facing the realistic possibility of life in prison if convicted. But Nadia's fish and chicken occupied a specific and significant location. It sat directly adjacent to NLMB's own territory, an area populated by people with both the motive and, more importantly, the means to discourage anyone from cooperating with prosecutors. According to street accounts that circulated in the years following the arrest, an unspoken understanding took hold in the neighborhood. Anyone who testified against Morris in open court risked facing the same fate as the 4 men he was accused of killing. Morris himself spent approximately 3 years in custody awaiting trial, during which, according to people connected to him, he maintained complete silence about the case and notably never implicated his alleged accomplice in any way, regardless of the pressure that incarceration might have placed on him to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. While incarcerated, he reportedly continued to have disciplinary issues, including at least 1 additional charge stemming from gang-related gestures captured on camera while in custody. During this same period, his cousin, the prominent Chicago rapper G Herbo, reportedly provided financial support for a private legal team to represent him, a detail that introduces an important and recurring theme in this story: the way Morris's personal network, particularly his connection to a genuinely famous and commercially successful artist, would continue to shape the resources and opportunities available to him throughout the rest of this saga. When the case finally reached trial in June 2020, more than 3 years after the killings, prosecutors discovered that their eyewitnesses were no longer willing or able to testify. According to accounts of the proceedings, witnesses either failed to appear in court entirely or, when reached, claimed they could no longer recall details they had previously reported with confidence to investigators. Without any witnesses willing to take the stand and identify Morris under oath, prosecutors were left with the case built almost entirely on testimony that had simply evaporated. Morris was reportedly informed of his release through an emergency virtual court hearing while he was asleep in his cell, with the judge dismissing all 4 murder charges due to insufficient evidence to proceed. He walked out of Cook County custody a free man, having spent roughly 3 years incarcerated for a quadruple homicide that, under the law, was never proven against him in any courtroom. It's worth being precise about what that outcome actually means and what it doesn't. A dismissal due to a lack of evidence, particularly one driven by witness unavailability rather than any factual finding of innocence, is not a legal determination that the underlying allegations were false. It means the state could not meet its burden of proof at that specific moment with the specific evidence available to it. The American legal system is built deliberately around requiring exactly that standard of proof before depriving someone of their liberty. And Morris's case is a stark, uncomfortable illustration of what happens when a community's fear of retaliation effectively prevents that standard from ever being tested. Whatever the truth of what happened at Nadia's Fish and Chicken on March 30th, 2017, the legal record now reflects a dismissal, not a conviction, and Morris Harris has never been convicted of those 4 killings. This particular outcome, a case collapsing specifically because witnesses became unreachable or unwilling to testify is not unique to Morris's situation. It reflects a documented, recurring pattern in cities with concentrated gang violence, where prosecutors have repeatedly described witness intimidation, whether explicit or simply implied through community-wide understanding, as one of the single greatest obstacles to securing convictions in exactly this kind of case. Some jurisdictions have experimented with expanded witness protection programs, anonymous testimony provisions, and other procedural tools specifically designed to counteract this dynamic, with mixed and often limited success, since the underlying fear driving witness silence frequently has less to do with formal legal protections and everything to do with an accurate, lived understanding of what retaliation in that specific neighborhood has historically looked like. For prosecutors building cases in environments like Terror Town, that dynamic means that even genuinely strong initial evidence, multiple independent eyewitness identifications, a clear motive, an unmasked shooter can simply dissolve over the years it takes a case to reach trial, regardless of how compelling that evidence appeared at the time of arrest. It is also worth noting how unusual the 3-year gap between arrest and trial in this case actually was, even by the standards of an already overburdened criminal court system. Cases involving multiple murder charges and high pre-trial stakes typically move with at least some urgency, precisely because witness memory and availability tend to degrade significantly over time, a fact prosecutors are generally well aware of. The extended delay in Morris's case, whatever combination of court backlog, legal maneuvering, and procedural complexity produced it, effectively gave the surrounding neighborhood years to fully absorb the unspoken consequences of cooperating with the state, consequences that, by the time trial finally arrived, appear to have fully neutralized the prosecution's original evidentiary advantage. Upon his release, Morris returned to his old neighborhood as something close to a legend within it, having survived an extraordinarily severe set of charges and walked away without a conviction, a level of street credibility that, within the specific value system of that world, is difficult to overstate. He began building a music career under a new name, Drench, leaning directly into the reputation that had preceded him, with his early tracks reportedly accumulating substantial views, driven significantly by his existing notoriety rather than conventional music industry promotion. His cousin G Herbo, by this point an established and commercially successful national rap artist, began bringing him along to high-profile industry events, reportedly including award shows and recording sessions alongside major artists. The dynamic here is worth sitting with for a moment. Within certain corners of the industry, having someone with Morris's specific documented street reputation in your orbit functions as a form of protection and legitimacy that money alone cannot purchase. Multiple artists in this space have spoken in various contexts about the value of having people in their circle whose reputation discourages others from testing them, and Morris's survival of a quadruple homicide case, true or not in every detail, had cemented exactly that kind of reputation. This particular economy, where personal proximity to documented or alleged violence becomes a form of currency within the broader entertainment industry, has become an increasingly visible and increasingly discussed feature of certain corners of contemporary hip-hop, particularly within drill and adjacent subgenres. Artists with significant commercial platforms frequently surround themselves with associates whose street credibility serves a dual function, providing genuine, practical security in an industry where threats and violence are an unfortunately real occupational hazard, and simultaneously reinforcing the authenticity of the artist's own persona by association. For someone in Morris's position, this arrangement offered a pathway to financial stability and a degree of legitimate mainstream visibility that very few people who survive serious criminal cases in neighborhoods like Terror Town ever actually access. It did not, however, offer an exit from the underlying world that had produced the original violence in the first place. If anything, it tied his continued relevance and income more tightly to maintaining exactly the kind of reputation that had nearly cost him his freedom. Around this same period, Morris and a close childhood friend reportedly co-founded a new, smaller subset within NLMB, a tight-knit group built around the same name as his music persona, with reported entry requirements built explicitly around demonstrated willingness to engage in violence on the group's behalf, a structure mirroring similar small, elite subsets that have emerged within other Chicago gang factions in recent years. These smaller subsets, often referred to within Chicago's gang ecosystem using language borrowed loosely from corporate or military hierarchy, function as a kind of internal credentialing system, separating a broader, looser set of affiliated members from a tighter, more committed inner circle whose status is earned specifically through participation in violence rather than simple geographic association. For a set like NLMB, already fractured and reshaped by years of casualties among its older leadership, these smaller, more exclusive groupings have increasingly become the primary vehicle through which reputation, resources, and ongoing conflict get organized and passed down to the next generation of members. The world Morris had returned to after his release had not become any safer simply because he had beaten his case. In October 2020, just months after walking out of Cook County custody, Morris was allegedly involved in a shooting connected to a rival faction associated with the earlier killing of a different NLMB member years prior. According to police reports, Morris was driving the vehicle while his close associate fired the shots that killed a rival, with surveillance footage reportedly capturing distinctive clothing worn by one of the men involved in the vehicle shortly after the incident, evidence that police cited in their report identifying Maurice as the driver in that case. By August 2021, Morris's associate was arrested and charged in connection with that killing, along with associated firearms charges. He was ultimately convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison, a sentence that, as of this writing, keeps him incarcerated until at least 2040. Morris himself was not charged in connection with that specific killing, despite being named as the alleged driver in the police report, another instance in this story where the specific legal accountability assigned to him diverged considerably from what the underlying allegations suggested. This pattern, repeated allegations of serious, often lethal violence without resulting convictions specifically against Morris himself, is one of the more striking and difficult to explain aspects of his entire public story. Whether that reflects a genuine pattern of him avoiding direct legal accountability through some combination of community-enforced silence and procedural fortune, or whether street rumor and reputation have simply attributed more to him than can actually be proven, is a question the public record alone cannot fully answer. As Morris's music career under the Drench name continued to grow, he never fully separated himself from the world that had produced his original notoriety. His lyrics frequently referenced ongoing street conflicts directly, and according to various unverified street accounts and online speculation that followed him for years, he was allegedly connected to additional violent incidents during this period, including the killing of a rival figure who had previously mocked him online following his father's murder and his own arrest. None of these additional allegations resulted in formal charges against him, and they should be understood as exactly that, allegations and street rumor rather than established legal facts. What is clear is that Chicago police maintained sustained interest in Morris throughout this period, a fact that several accounts suggest was driven in part by frustration within law enforcement that he had avoided conviction on the quadruple homicide charge, despite what they believed was substantial evidence against him. That kind of sustained law enforcement attention, whether or not it reflects accurate suspicion in every individual instance, created an environment in which Morris's continued freedom remained, in a practical sense, perpetually contingent on the next encounter with police going his way. That contingency caught up with him in 2024. Federal agents executed a raid on an apartment in the Chicago area connected to Morris's girlfriend at the time, who was reportedly under investigation in connection with an alleged fraud scheme involving several $100,000. Morris happened to be staying at the apartment after returning from an out-of-town performance and was present when federal agents arrived, a circumstance that had nothing directly to do with the original target of the raid. According to federal court records, as agents entered, Morris was observed leaning out a window and discarding a firearm onto a nearby rooftop, where it was subsequently recovered. The weapon was reportedly a Glock-style pistol modified with an illegal conversion device, commonly referred to as a switch, which allows a semi-automatic handgun to fire in a fully automatic mode loaded with an extended magazine. Federal prosecutors treat switches as a significant aggravating factor in firearms cases, given the dramatically increased rate of fire and corresponding potential for harm, and Maurice faced the realistic possibility of a maximum federal sentence in connection with the weapon. During subsequent bond hearings, federal prosecutors reportedly introduced some of Morris's own music videos and lyrics as evidence, arguing that his recorded content reflected lived experience rather than creative exaggeration, a now familiar legal tactic that has drawn significant controversy across the broader hip-hop and legal community in recent years, given the risk of treating artistic persona and lyrical exaggeration as literal confession. The same authenticity that had built his reputation and his music career was once again being used directly against him in a courtroom, just as it had been throughout much of his adult life. This recurring use of an artist's own creative output as courtroom evidence has become one of the more contested legal practices touching the broader drill and gang-adjacent music scene over the past several years. Defense attorneys and civil liberties advocates have repeatedly argued that treating lyrics, which frequently traffic in exaggeration, persona, and a specific kind of performative bravado common across virtually every genre of music with violent themes, as literal, factual confession sets a standard that would never be applied to other forms of artistic expression. Prosecutors counter that in cases where an artist's lyrical content closely tracks specific, real, documented events, the line between performance and admission becomes considerably harder to maintain. Morris's case sat squarely within that unresolved tension, with federal prosecutors betting that a judge would find his catalog of violent, specific lyrical content compelling enough to justify denying bond, a bet that, in the end, contributed to him spending roughly 2 years in federal custody before his eventual release. Morris was ultimately convicted on the federal firearms charge connected to the 2024 raid and served approximately 2 years in federal custody. During his incarceration, accounts circulated, reportedly drawn from leaked or intercepted communications, describing him expressing frustration about the conditions of his confinement, a stark contrast to the private jet travel and major label studio sessions that had defined the years immediately following his release from the quadruple homicide case. He was released from federal custody in June 2026, returning once again to the same neighborhood, the same reputation, and almost certainly the same level of sustained law enforcement attention that had followed him for the better part of a decade. Morris Harris's story resists the kind of tidy moral framing that true crime content often reaches for, and it's worth being honest about exactly why. On one level, this is a story about grief curdling into catastrophic violence. A teenager who lost his father to gun violence and, according to the charges filed against him, responded within hours by taking 4 lives that had no real connection to that loss. A response that, if the allegations are accurate, reflects an almost incomprehensible escalation from personal tragedy into indiscriminate retaliation against people who simply existed within the wrong social and geographic category at the wrong moment. On another level, this is a story about the specific, documented failure of a community's trust in the legal system to protect witnesses, a failure with consequences that extend well beyond any single case. When people who witness violent crime conclude rationally that testifying poses a greater immediate danger to their own life than staying silent, the result is not justice deferred. It is justice that simply does not happen, regardless of what actually occurred. Morris Harris was never convicted of the quadruple homicide that defined the first chapter of his adult life, and under the law, he remains, on that specific charge, not guilty. Whether that legal outcome aligns with the actual truth of what happened at Nadia's Fish and Chicken on March 30th, 2017, is a question this case, by its very design and outcome, was never able to answer. What can be said with more confidence is that the broader pattern surrounding Morris's life, the inherited gang affiliation, the extraordinarily early exposure to gun violence, the loss of his father, the cycle of retaliation that followed, and the way his survival of serious charges was subsequently converted into commercial and cultural capital within a specific corner of the music industry reflects something larger and more troubling than any individual's choices alone. It reflects an environment that, generation after generation, continues producing young men whose entire understanding of conflict resolution, status, and even fatherhood itself has been shaped almost entirely by violence, with very few credible alternative paths ever made genuinely available to them. There is also something worth examining in how readily the broader culture surrounding this corner of the music industry absorbed Morris's story and converted it into entertainment value rather than treating it as the tragedy it represents on every side. 4 families lost sons, brothers, and in 2 cases, both members of the same sibling pair on a single afternoon with no one ever held legally accountable. A father's life ended in gun violence after decades spent embedded in exactly the kind of conflict that eventually claimed him. A teenager's entire adolescence was defined by arrests, gunfire, and loss before he was old enough to vote. And the eventual public framing of all of this within certain online spaces and even within some of Morris's own promotional material leaned heavily into language of survival, toughness, and street credibility, treating his ability to walk away from a quadruple homicide charge as something closer to an achievement than as the deeply ambiguous, genuinely tragic outcome it actually represents for everyone involved, including, in a different sense, for Morris himself. Morris Harris is, as of mid-2026, a free man, out of federal custody, and back in the neighborhood that raised him. Whether his story ends there or whether it adds another chapter to an already extraordinary and disturbing record is something only time will determine. What remains unchanged is the original tragedy at the center of all of it. 4 men who had no connection to a father's murder, killed in the span of a single afternoon, whose families have never seen anyone convicted for their deaths.